Diesel versus petrol engines, similarities and the differences. Let's start with the differences. Okay, so diesel, petrol. Let us look at the differences. Number one, build quality. Diesel engine, heavier, bulky. Petrol engines are generally lighter, okay, and it has an easy build. Difference number two, diesel engine uses compression by ignition technology. So this one compresses air and then it ignites diesel into the compressed air, and the diesel ignites and therefore gets the engine to generate the power. So compresses air and then the fuel is injected. For a petrol engine, this one compresses a mixture of air plus petrol, and ignition is done by a spark plug. Therefore, all the electricals that are responsible for making the spark plugs work is not present in the diesel engine. Another difference is because diesel compresses air and then fuel is injected, the fuel pump runs at very high pressures. So, fuel pump runs at high pressures, and therefore they become noisy. This noise also results from the heavier, bulky build of the diesel engine. However, in some petrol engines that use direct injection also run very high pressure fuel pumps. But those that are port injected do not run very high pressure pumps. So there is also the one that is port injected, and there's the direct injection, and some cars also use the dual systems of fuel delivery. Okay, so another difference between petrol and diesel engines is that petrol has got, I would say, the maintenance costs on both engines is relative, okay, depending on the engine that you're running. But generally, petrol engines have high running costs. And the simple reason is because you have the fuel system, you have the engine, and you also have the ignition system. But in diesel engine, there is a lower running costs because you don't have many components that need to be replaced when you are talking about when the maintenance is due. For example, when you're talking about the electrical and the ignition system plus the spark plugs, you have the ignition coils, okay? You have so many other areas that also needs to be checked. But with diesel, you have lower running costs. However, some diesel engines, especially those that run on passenger cars, can be expensive to maintain because you will need frequent service, especially the frequent oil changes. And also, the running costs might be high when you have modern diesel engines with a turbo, okay? Because now you need frequent oil changes, okay? So in terms of performance, diesel engines have a high torque, and so the torque is high, and we have a low horsepower, whereas a petrol engine will give you high horsepower versus low torque. Although with modern technology and with direct injection in petrol engines, we're finding that they are developing better torque, But generally, this is the principle that you have in terms of performance for diesel engines. For example, a diesel engine will develop a high torque, and that's the reason why these engines will be used in commercial vehicles that need to tow heavy loads, okay? Because the speed is not a factor, but you need the torque. You need the torque in order to push those heavy loads. And in petrol engines, you have a high horsepower, so it generates speed, but does not really generate that high torque. By the way, and if you have to look at the differences between horsepower and torque, which is usually a very controversial subject, horsepower is actually the turning strength, the ability to turn. Okay, so that is torque. Torque is actually the ability to turn. Sorry for that mix up. Torque is the ability to turn. So with diesel engines, they are able to turn with, with greater strength than they are able to run fast. Okay, so that is the difference. So you find in diesel engines, yes, you have a high torque, you have a high turning force, but you do not have the engine running necessarily so fast. Which brings us to another difference, is that diesel engines are low RPM engines versus the petrol engines, which are high RPM engines. And the high RPM is so that they are able to achieve the high horsepower. And the diesel, they do not really need to run on very high RPMs, because, as we said, the engine is heavy, it's bulky, and therefore cannot be able to achieve these very high RPMs. So basically, these are the differences between diesel and petrol engines, and these differences is why you will find that petrol engines are a favorite for cars that need to run fast, lighter cars and lighter mobility solutions like a motorcycle, and that's the reason why you will not find a motorcycle running on diesel. However, you will find a tuk-tuk running on diesel because it needs to carry heavy and bulky items. Okay, it needs that high torque in order to to be able to carry goods and be able to do the commercial activities, but does not really necessarily need to develop high speed, because then if you have something that is supported on 3 wheels running so fast, then even chances of it toppling over are very high. So these are the major differences that you have between a diesel and a petrol engine. Now, do we have similarities between these two, between a diesel and a petrol engine? There are basically no similarities that I can come across. Because if you talk about all the systems that you can talk about in a vehicle, the fuel system, the ignition system, okay, and you also have the fuel delivery, and then we have the cooling system, and then we have the lubrication system, which are basically the major systems in these engines. You'll find that the lubrication system is basically the same, though diesel engines will tend to use heavier oils, okay, than petrol engines. The cooling system is basically the same, because right now we have petrol diesel engines that are fitted with a turbo, and we also have turbo diesel engines, so they develop very high temperatures. So the cooling system has been optimized across the board. We also have the fuel delivery system, which we have, as we discussed, these are direct injection engines, so the fuel pumps usually run at very high pressures, and you also have the direct injection system in petrol engines nowadays. So you also have those high fuel pressure pumps running. And when you look at the ignition system, we only have it in the petrol engine. It is not present in the diesel engine. However, there is a function in some diesel engines called those glow sparks that are used to ignite this fuel into the cylinder when the engine is starting at cold temperatures. So, and then the fuel is basically the same. We have petrol in petrol engines, we have diesel in diesel engines. Diesel is heavier, and it's less volatile compared to petrol, which is lighter and more volatile. Diesel is basically cheaper in our country compared to petrol by up to about 20 shillings per liter. Diesel is prone to being contaminated and being adulterated more than petrol. Okay, and both of these engines, they are also sensitive to adulteration of fuel because we have them running on very high pressures and also have the direct injection, and we have these nozzles in both engines which can get clogged and can develop tar formation when you have adulteration in both. Okay, so I hope this has been an insightful, informative video. Please remember to subscribe for more of this content. Thank you.